Welcome to the Jack Miller Center webinar, 1619 versus 1776, Why Was America Founded? We're joined today by Lucas Morel and Wilfred McClay. I'm just going to say a few words about the format. You guys can watch us, we won't hear you. If you have a question for either of our guests, enter your question into the Q&A box. It's at the bottom right of your Zoom screen if you're using the desktop application. There was a poll you can look at, and we'll have one at the end as well. You can use the chat box as well, but again, if you want to ask a question, send it in the Q&A box. If you want to ask the question live with audio, include that in your question and we'll allow you to get on the mic and ask that question. So let me introduce our speakers today. First, we have Bill McClay, who is the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. A nice long title that takes a while to say. His research interests focus on the intellectual and cultural history of the United States, with especially focus on the 19th and 20th centuries. I'd recommend two books by him, The Masterless, The Self and Society in Modern America, and then especially in connection with today's topic, his textbook, Land of Hope, An Invitation to the Great American Story. Bill is also on the board of the Jack Miller Center. We also have Lucas E. Morel, who is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University, a title long enough to compete against Bill's. His research interests include Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Ralph Ellison. His most recent book is Lincoln and the American Founding. Again, another title that has a lot to do with what we're hoping to talk about today. He's also been involved in some of the programming the Jack Miller Center has been doing with high school teachers, which is, again, appropriate. So the format we're going to have is Professor McClay's going to make a sort of introductory statement. Professor Morel will make a statement, and then we'll get the conversation started. And as soon as you have a question that comes to your mind, I'd really encourage you to send it in so we can get the questions to them. Having said that, I'll turn it over to Professor McClay.
Thanks, Tom, and welcome everybody. It's really great to be together, even in the most ethereal and virtual way. It's better than not being together at all. And I hope that our remarks today can help you at least think more clearly about the stakes in this particular controversy. And by way of background, it began, the New York Times in August of 2019 published on the 400th anniversary of the what is believed to be the first appearance of enslaved Africans in what would become the United States. The 20-some Africans who were deposited in Jamestown and then sold for victuals, as John Rolfe says in the really much basically the historical record we rely on for this. There's a lot of controversy about even whether 1619 is a particularly significant date in the history of slavery in the Western Hemisphere, in the history of even British slavery in the Western Hemisphere. But we'll leave that aside. What the idea that behind the Times' effort, which consisted of a full expanded version of the New York Times Magazine, entirely devoted to this subject, edited by a fairly senior editor at the Times named Nicole Hannah-Jones, who had made her mark in investigative reporting relating to issues of race. And she had assembled a cast of contributors who wrote basically short essays. Some of the pieces were literary in character, others were reportage, some historical, some sociological, all relating to aspects of the 400 years of the African American experience in America. But that part of it wasn't really the source of the controversy. The source of the controversy was her essay, her introductory essay, and then the general introduction that we don't know who wrote it, whether it was her or Jake Silverstein, the Times Magazine's editor. It may have been a combination of the two, but that made some extremely provocative claims, shall we say, that 1619 should be considered, or that at least the possibility should be considered, that 1619 and not 1776 was the nation's true founding. So that the July 4th, 1776 that we think of as the date in which the United States of America comes into being as an independent nation, as an independent and distinct entity in the world, is not really the nation's true founding. That the true founding goes back to this earlier period, and that everything, there are a lot of very hyperbolic claims that are made, especially in the introductory materials, and to some extent in Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay, which Lucas is going to analyze, so I don't want to tread on that very much. But the introductory essay made the argument that the true founding was 1619, and that the anti-Black racism was encoded like in the DNA of the United States, and it's quite, as I say, provocative way of looking at our national history, insisting that slavery and in the aftermath of slavery, the consequences of slavery, needs to be seen as a central part of the American experience. Well, speaking here probably only for myself, but I actually think for most historians and most Americans, certainly most historians, a lot of that is should not be controversial. The notion that slavery and the aftermath of slavery and the consequences of slavery is central to our national experience, I regard as an uncontroversial assertion. That it's the central element is something else again, and I think that's really where the Times has tried to go with this, to say that that 1619 sort of cast the die, as it were, for what was to come, and that one of the statements in the preface is that all of the great achievements of American civilization, its economic prosperity, its extraordinary innovation, its energy, dynamism, that all of these things are ultimately attributable to slavery. The essays making up the entire volume don't make that case, but it's an assertion that frames the project as a whole. So it's a very mixed bag. I think that again, speaking for myself, I think to condemn the project as a whole would be a mistake. I think what it is a missed opportunity. I think 1619 could have been understood as a way of putting before the American people the fact that African Americans are not just a sort of tangential part of American history, but as W.E.B. Du Bois says in Souls of Black Folk, he says, before the Puritans came, we were here. And that is true. If 1619 comes before 1620, before the Pilgrims came. Actually, that's the term that Du Bois uses also. That African Americans are central to the American experience, and the African American struggle is central to the American experience. And actually, the Times project could have easily been framed in this way, but they chose this more incendiary path. And I can't I don't think it would be appropriate in this juncture, in this setting, to speculate on the motives for that. But I think it makes it a missed opportunity. That something that could have expanded our sense of the national remit of what and who we are as a nation could, and what we embrace, what we include in our national history, instead is cast in a narrative oppression, a narrative, an oppression narrative, a narrative of oppression, a gloss of oppression, as Shelby Steele would say. So I think that's very unfortunate. As for the 1619 versus 1776, I think something that is relevant here is it made me think immediately, and strangely it has not come up in much of the subsequent commentary, but of Hamilton's comment in Federalist Number 1, right at the end of the first paragraph. He says, starting in the middle of the paragraph, it's been frequently remarked that seem to have been reserved to the people of this country by their conduct and example to decide the important question whether societies of men are really capable or not of establishing good government from reflection and choice, and whether they're forever destined to depend for their political constitutions on accident and force. I mean, a way to say the founding was 1619 was to say that America, the United States of America, did not represent a departure in any substantive way from the brutal history of the human race, which has included slavery always, very much the rule rather than exception. Slavery existed in Africa, slavery existed in the Caribbean. It wasn't the invention of Europeans. It is the notion that we can establish a regime on the basis of reflection and choice by the enunciation, if not the perfect adherence to, principles, high principles. One of them being that a people can rule itself, that we are not born into classes of those who are fit to rule, a very small number of those who are fit to rule, and those who are fit to be subjects. The whole notion of moving from subjects to citizens, that's a big part of what 1776 and 1789, 1787, 89 are about the human intellect, the human capacity for principled behavior, and to draw in a meaningful way on the knowledge of the past, overcomes or has the capability to overcome this sort of brutal history of what happens by accident and force, which is what the bulk of history tells us. Human existence, human political societies are going to be like. So there is, no matter how thin you slice it, there's an extraordinary moment that comes with the establishment of the United States. And to a lot of us, the offensive thing about the 1619 project was that it denied that. Even as it drew, in some ways, on conceptions of justice that were part of the founding. Again, I'm treading a little bit on Lucas's territory, but one of the things phrases that used in our founding principles were a lie when they were written. Well, I'm going to let Lucas deal with that more, but of course that's a statement that draws upon those principles in order to issue its condemnation, and that is somewhat self-contradictory. I should add here that we are not the only ones criticizing this, as you well know. Very soon after the 1619 project was published, and it became clear that it was part of a large-scale educational effort with the preparation of materials to go into high schools. A number of us objected. I wrote an article about it, and perhaps more notably, 5 leading historians wrote a letter to the Times. They had already expressed their profound reservations about the project and its sort of signal assertions in other venues, including the World Socialist website. of all places, but wonderful interviews that are well worth reading. Gordon Wood, who I think is the most eminent living American historian of the United States, and Sean Wilentz of Princeton, who is certainly an incredibly distinguished fellow, who wrote a book on the issue of whether the Constitution is or is not a pro-slavery document, coming down on the anti. No, it is not a pro-slavery document. It was not meant to be one. And several others, all equally eminent people, objected to the Times and asked them to make corrections, not to retract the whole thing, but to make corrections, and the Times refused. So that's where we are. We have a document that leading historians, leading scholars say is deeply flawed, and an organization that's committed to sort of saying, well, this is our interpretation, and history is about different interpretations, and so on. I could go into more detail, but I think I've just about used up my time. So let me pass the baton to my eminent colleague, Lucas, to finish the job.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I just want to reiterate, if you have any questions for Bill or anything that occurs to your mind, send in the question in the Q&A box, and now we'll turn to Lucas for his piece.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Bill. The lead essay of the 1619 Project is an essay about visibility. It's about how we see America's founding, how we see Black Americans, their role in this country's development, and ultimately how we see each other, both as fellow citizens and human beings. Ralph Ellison, the author of one of the great American novels, Invisible Man, called this moral perception, the perception of the wholeness of American life and the cost of its successes and its failures. I think that the good part of Hannah Jones's essay is its Ellisonian part. As she tells it, she eventually recognized that her father's steadfast devotion to the United States, despite the racial bigotry he experienced, owed to his recognition of how much his country was the product of Black American blood, sweat, toil, and tears. To betray America would be to betray the many ways his Black American ancestors helped shape America's language, literature, and political and economic history. And so Hannah Jones comes to appreciate her father's patriotism because it flows from his awareness that America's redeeming qualities were in part the product of a people forged in the crucible of American slavery and segregation. Her mistake was to interpret American history as a zero-sum story, where the recovered strivings of Black folk had to displace the recorded achievements of white folk, especially those we have long been taught to view as iconic representatives of the American way. What was needed was a more capacious revision of American history, one that incorporated the heroic participation and fealty of Black Americans, while also wrestling more sympathetically with the challenge the founders faced in establishing a free society in a land accustomed to racial slavery. Instead, riddled with half-truths, overstatements, out-of-context quotations, and errors of fact and interpretation about the founding and Lincoln, her history distorts our past and actually works at cross purposes with her argument that it was Black Americans who fought to make our ideals true. Nicole Hannah-Jones once tweeted, "We were quite literally founded on slavery. All 13 colonies practiced it." The mere existence of slavery on American soil constitutes a founding in her mind. It doesn't occur to her that when those colonies declared on July 4th, 1776, that all men are created equal, and its related self-evident truths about the natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and government by consent of the governed, they were announcing a constitutional way of life that would bind them morally to eliminate slavery at some point in time. In fact, 6 of the original 13 colonies banned slavery in the early years of the Republic. If slavery was the driving force of American politics, why did 6 American states get rid of it? Why did Vermont, the 14th American state, enter the Union with an anti-slavery constitution? And what about the monumental court cases in Massachusetts between 1781 and 83, where Elizabeth Freeman and Quock Walker, enslaved Black people, sued for their freedom? In that American state, enslaved Black people not only had the legal right to sue, but also won their suits on the basis of a plain reading of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution. For a nation supposedly founded on slavery, this state actually had a constitution and laws written by white men that rather quickly produced not only the freedom of those Black litigants, but also the abolition of the very institution of slavery. Had Hannah Jones read the writings of slaveholders like Washington, Jefferson, and Madison, she would have learned that they not only acknowledged its injustice, but also discussed the obstacles to emancipation in the near term. The American founders were revolutionaries, to be sure, but prudence marked their efforts to establish national independence in light of the pre-existing institution of slavery in the 13 diverse states. During the Revolutionary War and the early efforts to cement a union of the American states, the founders did not believe that they could free themselves and free their slaves at the same time. To insist on the latter as a condition of the former would have doomed both imperatives. For example, South Carolina and Georgia were land rich and labor poor, and so were hesitant to do anything too quickly to stem the flow of slaves into their states. To lose their support during the Revolutionary War, when only a united effort to throw off British rule promised any hope of success, would have made an already audacious enterprise much less likely to succeed. The essay reflects a woeful ignorance of the writings of the founders, who always affirmed that all human beings possess natural rights. The slaveholding founders were all too aware that the enslaved had legitimate grievances. As Jefferson put it, 10,000 recollections by the Blacks of the injuries they have sustained will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, which will probably never end, but in the extermination of the one or the other race. Jefferson admitted that deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites further complicated any attempt to free Blacks in a way that would enable them to enjoy their natural rights. He thought emancipation would need to be followed by expatriation or colonization in order to induce a white population fearful of retribution by former slaves to secure justice for the enslaved. This was speculation on his part, but not unfounded, as the Gabriel Prosser revolt in Virginia and the Haitian Revolution led by Toussaint Louverture illustrated the potential for a race war wherever slaves outnumbered the white population. Nicole Hannah-Jones also does not take into account that the Declaration of Independence was approved while American colonists were at war with Great Britain, fighting for their independence, a war that would not conclude until the Treaty of Paris of 1783. She also does not seem to appreciate that the power to free American slaves was not delegated to the Second Continental Congress. More importantly, their political independence was not guaranteed, and therefore attempting to free themselves and their slaves at the same time would not increase their chances for success, but could very well undermine both objectives. Harvey Mansfield recently put it this way: the American founding couldn't be perfect from the start. It had to progress toward its goal. Prudence is the faculty that deals with imperfection in order to form, as the preamble put it, a more perfect union. Now for the ugly, her account of Lincoln. To complete her takedown of the founders, of course, she must take down their greatest defender, Abraham Lincoln. She claims that Lincoln believed that free Black people were a troublesome presence, incompatible with a democracy intended only for white people. She omits that Lincoln was describing Kentucky Senator and slaveholder Henry Clay's opinion regarding the difficulty of having free Blacks and enslaved Blacks live in the same community. In an 1850 eulogy, speaking of Clay's leadership of the American Colonization Society, this is what Lincoln actually said. He, Clay, considered it no demerit in the society that it tended to relieve slaveholders from the troublesome presence of the free Negroes. By the 1850s, the agitation over slavery was threatening to divide the Union, and the prospects for peaceful, lawful abolition looked increasingly distant. Clay's efforts to encourage free Blacks to establish a self-governing colony in Africa met with Lincoln's approval because he thought it could help lessen the growing divide in America and perhaps facilitate the eventual emancipation of all enslaved Blacks on American soil. When Hannah Jones asserts anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country, and she cites Lincoln's presidency as yet another example of how this played out poorly for Blacks in American history, she gives no credit to the president who did the most to preserve, protect, and defend, even to the point of war, the Constitution and the kind of country that could secure the rights of racial minorities. There's no mention of Lincoln's vigorous critique of the 1857 Dred Scott opinion, wherein he lambasts Chief Justice Roger Taney for reading Black people out of the Declaration of Independence. And he laments that all the powers of earth seem rapidly combining against them. There's no mention of the Gettysburg Address, which Lincoln delivered in the year following his Emancipation Proclamation, challenging the nation to experience a new birth of freedom, one that would now include 3 to 4 million Black people as fellow citizens, deserving the protection of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. There's no mention of Lincoln's second inaugural address, an oration unsurpassed in its acknowledgement that slavery was a profound wrong committed by America toward her Black inhabitants, and which the Almighty may have rectified by allowing a devastating civil war and yielding an emancipation that neither side seriously expected. There's no mention of Lincoln's repeated advocacy of giving Blacks the vote in 1864 and 1865, when only 6 states in the entire United States allowed Blacks to vote. Of course, there's no mention that Lincoln was assassinated because of these efforts, and for which Frederick Douglass called him the first martyr president of the United States. Lincoln did not believe the founders were hypocrites, generally speaking. As he put it, "We had slavery among us. We could not get our Constitution unless we permitted them to remain in slavery. We could not secure the good we did secure if we grasped for more. And having by necessity submitted to that much, it does not destroy the principle that is the charter of our liberties." He thought the founders did not think they could free themselves and free their slaves at the same time without hazarding the success of both their independence and their new way of governing themselves. That Hannah Jones is unaware of or oblivious to Lincoln's efforts on behalf of Black Americans muddles her attempt to view American history through the lens of Black patriotism. Throughout American history, Black Americans have needed both the institutions and the people, which includes the vast white majority of the United States, to ensure progress in protecting their civil and political rights. Despite her claim that, for the most part, Black Americans fought back alone, they simply could not do this without the help of a whole lot of white Americans. Let American history provide the example, provide the lesson. Consider the landmark 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the unanimous school desegregation decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Without significant white majorities, none of these pivotal constitutional and political events could have occurred. Surely the progress Americans have made on this front had everything to do with the principle of equality taking hold over more and more Americans, most of whom were white. To assert that anti-Black racism runs in the very DNA of this country is to turn a blind eye to the profound conviction of most white Americans that all men are created equal and deserve an equal opportunity to pursue the American dream. Understood this way, one is compelled to see not 1619, but 1776 as the legitimate origin of the meaning of America and the key driver of America's political development, which I read as one long civil rights movement. As President Bill Clinton said in his first inaugural address, our democracy must be not only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. If Americans of all races learn that the spirit of '76 reflects the better angel of our political nature and not some demon to be exorcised, then they can reclaim their common political heritage. Only then can diverse Americans live out their national motto, E pluribus unum, and have a reasonable hope for unity, even as they debate the means by which they seek to secure the common good. But if Americans lack a conviction about the essential goodness of the United States, a goodness that Hannah Jones makes more difficult to see and understand, our political polarization will continue to get worse. The racial mindedness of the left and the right will keep Americans caught, to quote Ralph Ellison, between what they profess to believe and what they feel they can't do without. During our greatest crisis of national identity, the American Civil War, Lincoln and many fellow Americans, Black and white, did their best to preserve what was right about the founding in the face of both misinterpretations and outright rejections of the founders. In the end, Nicole Hannah-Jones' essay is, as Bill mentioned already, a missed opportunity to help Americans understand our past better and therefore enable us to see and trust one another as fellow citizens of our common republic.
Thank you, Professor Morel. I was going to give you, Professor McClay, a moment to say anything you want to say in addition. Otherwise, we can go to some questions already. I think you're muted.
Now, I think that was magnificent, and I actually don't really have a lot to add to it, except to say that I'm struck by how hard it is for even very, very intelligent and well-educated people to think historically, which is one of the things that I think Lucas's talk does splendidly and very intelligently and humanely. That is that to expect people in the past to have shared our sensibilities, even in the face of a general milieu that was profoundly different from our own sensibilities, to lack that sense of how all historical actors have to act within a historical context, and that limits the ability of reformers, of statesmen, of others who are in the arena, as Theodore Roosevelt would say, to do things. We always say that politics is the art of the possible, and the possible is a reflection of those circumstances that both confine actors but also enable them. It is you are responding to circumstances with the best policies, the best initiatives that do the most good and the least harm, so that the thinking that we couldn't have our freedom and have the abolition of slavery, we would have to have one or the other, and probably would lose both if we made the wrong choice. So that's, I think, an exercise of profound historical awareness on Lincoln's part of the limits of what's possible, and I think that's something that a background in history, for us to condemn Jefferson, for example, for what are clearly, by our lights and by his own lights, hypocrisies, by his own lights, should not be grounds for condemnation. We need to look at the fact of how advanced his thinking was compared to others in his time, how the Declaration and his words and his example have been so important to so many people around the world and have been in the vanguard of freedom. There's a wonderful quotation that the late John Lewis gave on the around the time of Jefferson's, I think, 265th birthday, in which he said, you know, we all knew about his imperfections, but it was his words. His words were the fountain from which we took strength and encouragement. And I think that's pretty good testimony that maybe looking at what is at the achievements of someone like Jefferson, who's very much bound up in what we mean when we say 1776. We use that as a sort of symbol of a certain way of understanding America. That it's a good thing when we can understand that, like us, the people of the past are complex. Would any one of us want to have a standard of moral perfection applied to us that we apply to leaders in the past, particularly when we've never had the responsibility of leading ourselves? And those of us who have know something about how difficult it is to get things accomplished in this world. So anyway, I wonderful remarks in I think refutation of Nicole Hannah-Jones's essay, and a wonderful illustration of how important it is to think historically. You know, I think this whole episode of statues being torn down, one of the things that's been so appalling to a lot of us is that, you know, it's one thing to go after Confederate generals, although I think vandalism is never appropriate. But Frederick Douglass became one of the targets of attack. Incredible. And you know, Frederick Douglass isn't good enough for you. If Frederick Douglass isn't the hero of human rights, then I don't know what person in the past can stand. So.
Hey, Bill, if I can add something real quickly, maybe you can confirm this, but I had heard somewhere that Forrest McDonald once said that if you were a white person and lived in Jefferson's times, you would have owned slaves, but you sure as heck would never have written the Declaration of Independence.
That's right. Well, I didn't know that, but it sounds like him. It sounds exactly like him.
I'm going to try to throw in some questions from our audience. I'm actually going to begin with one that has to do with Lincoln. We'll have a bit of a thread there. This is from Anthony Ives, who was a Washington and Lee student, he says, in 2005 or so. He says, and this is for you, Lucas, you suggest that the most dishonest and misleading aspects of the 1619 Project, that it is wrong to paint Lincoln as a racist. Yet in writing, you have argued that one reason Lincoln said and wrote those things which are racist to contemporary ears was because he was speaking to an audience of his time, and that white supremacy was the norm in Illinois. Isn't this what Nicole Hannah-Jones says as well, that racism is in the DNA of America? Aren't you conceding just the same thing said in a different way? If I misunderstand you, what is the source of the norm of the white supremacy among white Illinois citizens, if not, quote, the DNA of America, i.e. the legal existence of race-based chattel slavery? So there's a challenge for you.
Yeah, that's a question that's well put. But let's put it this way. Lincoln, when he said his most controversial things about Black people in his debates with Stephen Douglas, he was speaking before an audience that was pervasively racist. But there is a fundamental difference between how Lincoln approached the racism of his audience and the way Stephen Douglas approached it. Stephen Douglas played to that racism by saying this country was formed by white people, for white people, and only for white people. He was a rank white supremacist and considered all other races inferior. Lincoln, on the other hand, knew that in order to get elected and to accomplish things on behalf of the Republican Party, which did not believe that there were natural inferiority of races, but believed in human equality, believed that the Declaration of Independence included Black people. What Lincoln did is he had to start with where his audience was and build a bridge to where he wanted them to go. And the way he did that was by not trying to push too quickly, for example, on civil and political rights for Black people in Illinois. For example, in Illinois, if you were a Black person, you could not serve in the militia, couldn't serve on a jury if a white person was a defendant. You were not allowed to vote. And in the 1850s, they actually banned the immigration of Black people into that state. That's the context within which Lincoln is speaking. And yet, even though he does not have a Black constituency to appeal to, he actually stands up for the natural rights of Black people. Why would he do that? If he thought that the racism of his constituents was rooted, deep-seated in their DNA. If it's in their DNA, they can't do anything about it. They cannot change. Douglas entrenches it further. Lincoln's comments always seek to ennoble, always seek to elevate, always seek to, as Publius put it in Federalist 10, refine and enlarge the public views. And so even though he had to appeal to a racist audience and did not say he believed that Black people should have the right to vote, he said that they were his equal, Judge Douglas's equal, and the equal of every human being. Now, why is this important? In the 1850s, the big struggle is, where is slavery going to be allowed to go? Is it going to be allowed to go in the territories? Roger Taney ruled that Congress didn't have the power to ban slavery from the territories. Stephen Douglas was trying to teach white Northerners not to care what happened to people who didn't look like them in those territories. Lincoln saw that this was the great threat, not Southern slaveholding, but to teach white Northerners to become indifferent to what happened to Black people. If that were to happen, this is what makes popular sovereignty so insidious. If that were to happen, slavery would become national, not with anybody actually arguing in favor of it. All you had to do was to teach white Northerners to become indifferent to the enslavement of Black people in the territories. And Lincoln said, in the not so distant future, slavery would become national. And so that's how I understand Lincoln and how he dealt with the racism of Illinois. He did not think it was a permanent fixture. He actually thought it could be elevated, that they could be shown, and that they could be shown that their way of feeling about Black people, a feeling that Lincoln himself shared being born in Kentucky, it was a feeling that they could outgrow if they trusted the principles of the Declaration of Independence.
Can I add a little something to that, Tom? Just that that was very well said, and I would just mention that the 1619 project is not just what was published that day in August of 2019, but it's an educational, ongoing educational project, and that the materials that appertain to it have went out to schools very quickly after the rollout of this. There really wasn't a chance to have a national debate about the contents of the report. Now, I may add something that Lucas didn't mention, or I think you did actually mention in passing, but the contention that the historians found most offensive and having no documentary basis was the assertion that Americans sought a revolution in order to protect the institution of slavery. This was a prime cause of the revolution, and there just simply isn't evidence for that. And that was one of the things that Gordon Wood and James McPherson and Will Entz and others stressed. But let me get back to the educational aspect. It matters to me what young people are being taught about their country, because history is a body of knowledge that has civic implications, and we can't very well complain about the lack of civic sentiment, civic spirit, civic dedication in our citizenry if our young people are taught to disparage every great person in their national history, and being taught to disparage them falsely or one-sidedly or inadequately and tendentiously. And that's, I think, what part of what we're struggling with here is that, we professors in our seminar rooms and our learned publications can argue things on a certain level where we can think the unthinkable and contemplate the uncontemplatable, but there's a real price to be paid if the public understanding of our history is polluted with really inadequate and destructive understandings and unfair understandings of our national past. So that doesn't mean that I'm advocating a sort of tissue of lies and fables and, Mason Weems like accounts of our glorious and godlike fathers and all of that. That's not at all what I'm talking about. I think an accurate depiction of Lincoln and the environment in which he was operating will disabuse anybody of the idea that we were kind of a utopia at that time. Be accurate, but have an understanding that the account of the past that you render has effects, and the 1619 project, as it filters out into the schools, has consequences. I not everything in it is bad, and that's something I want to stress again. But these framing essays are, I think, very contestable at the very least, and I think wrong.
So we have a couple of questions about this. I'm going to pick one and have you respond. If the 1619 project tones down its assertion about the singular founding experience, then we're not talking about it today. It becomes just another teaching tool alongside so many others. Therefore, can't we just see the New York Times assertion as a strategy for us to have this conversation, right? So we wouldn't be having this wonderful webinar without the New York Times. Instead of us just focusing on 1776, or rather 1789, as being America being a country of aspirational ideals as yet unfulfilled, the perpetuation of structural racism calls into question the ideals ever being fulfilled, makes them look like a bill of goods sold to poor Black and brown people. Now there will always be an asterisk next to 1776 or 1789, and that's the point. She's won by us having this conversation, making us parallel its toxic propaganda, ideological poison, as Professor McClay, I think, has called it, with that of the unfulfilled ideal. So a couple of questions about some positive role or positive effect the project may have had. So,
Can I say
well, look,
something?
did you direct that to me or to?
Either, yeah, I thought you could respond if either of you have something to say. Go ahead.
Well, it's sort of part of what was said reminds me of Mae West's old saying that there's no such thing as bad publicity. And, the Times has, we haven't talked about this, but the Times has used this kind of wildly incendiary assertion that 1619 was a real founding. Has little by little, it at first resisted the historians' complaints, and then Nicole Hannah-Jones has said, "Well, I never really meant this as history. It's journalism. It's designed to stir things up. It's designed to, it's narrative. So we're kind of left feeling a little bit as if we've been cheated. That something we took seriously wasn't really meant seriously. It was a publicity stunt. I don't see a whole lot of good to be said about that. But what I will say is that it's never a bad thing for us to revisit and reconsider even the most important things in our national life. That we are not about the business of sort of erecting monumental adages that then stand forever. I mean, when Hamilton said, going back to the quotation I read, that reflection and choice was the basis of a sound government rather than accident and force. That's part of what he's talking about. Of course, it can be helpful to remind ourselves of what is distinctive about this country, instead of allowing it to ossify into just a reflexive, yeah, well, you know, rah, rah, rah. And I think people who raise questions, you know, dissenters, you know, I'm a great believer in this sort of John Stuart Mill view that you don't really know what you think and can't really own your beliefs fully if you're not if you haven't experienced a challenge to them and haven't at least tried to understand what an alternative point of view might look like. So in that sense, I agree with, you were kind of merging two questions, right? But I agree that there's nothing fatal about our reconsidering thing. I'm concerned about the way that the 1619 Project filters down into schools. And as Howard Zinn's famous textbook, which is interestingly, I don't know of any reputable historian who thinks Zinn's book, People's History of the United States, is reliable. But it has sold 3 million copies. It's used in schools all over the country. And I think partly because it's actually well written. Unlike most textbooks. So it has a story, it has a narrative. It's a simplistic, cartoonish narrative, but it has a narrative and it's had an effect. I think those of us who think that that's wrong and that it's and false need to do a better job of upholding the other side. So look, a challenge is not a bad thing, but all the same, I would rather we weren't having this webinar or talking about something else.
May I add something real quickly here? We don't need the 1619 Project to talk about slavery. I have been teaching for over 25 years. I teach American government pretty much every year. It is impossible to teach the Declaration of Independence without talking about the slaveholder who drafted it. And so I am compelled, whether I like it or not, to actually assign writings by Jefferson where he talks about the injustice of slavery in the Notes on the State of Virginia, letters famously to John Holmes, among others. And so if anybody has been teaching the Declaration of Independence and ignoring slavery, that is a dereliction of duty. We did not need Nicole Hannah-Jones to come around and tell us that slaves were deposited at Point Comfort near Jamestown Colony in 1619. As I say, I have been teaching, to teach freedom in this country, you have to teach slavery. So we didn't need the New York Times Project for that.
Yeah, can I add to that? I mean, this is a point I made in the piece I wrote for commentary, that slavery has been at the center of American historiography for at least 100 years or more. And it's not, Nicole Hannah-Jones has said, well, her most recent statement that I've seen is in, well, you know, the point was to bring slavery into the national consciousness. Well, look, when I was in graduate school, slavery was a hot topic. Eugene Genovese, Herbert Gutman, there were these great path-breaking books on slavery coming out, and it's never stopped since then. It's been a very, very central subject in the study of history in graduate education, and I think it's just a misconception to think that historians have been ignoring it. It's if anything, the popularity of the subject has crowded out other traditional subjects like constitutional history and intellectual history and diplomatic history and others, because when I was at Tulane University, half the American historians were writing about slavery. It was the topic. So again, I agree with Lucas. I don't think And one other thing, and this may be a little more controversial, but I shouldn't be. One of the topics, I mentioned Herbert Gutman's book about the Black family. One of the topics that was very much on the table in the 80s when I was in grad school was what is the relationship between slavery, the institution of slavery, and the current racial inequalities of American society in the latter part of the 20th century. And the argument that people like Gutman made is that you need to look at other things. You need to look at Jim Crow. You need to look at developments in deindustrialization and so on. But that, in fact, there's a lively argument about this, that whether tracing our current woes back to slavery made much sense. Now, I think there's a way in which it obviously traces back, but at any rate, what I want to say is that this was this subject of controversy, and that when the Moynihan report, which is a byword for controversy, at least matters, came out and was expressed concern about the Black family, about children born out of wedlock, and what was happening in that realm. That was Gutman's book was partly a response to that. It was partly to say, hey, the Black family has been much stronger and more resilient through all of this tribulation than you think. So all I'm saying is that introducing 1619 isn't a abracadabra that opens the door to our understanding our current woes better and what to do about them.
Thanks. We're running out of time. I do want to, if you've got a minute, to at least respond to one more question. Since I began with two challenges, I'll do one that's maybe gives some room for expansion. This is for Professor Morel from a famous attendee named Anonymous. What do you think Ralph Ellison would think of the 1619 project?
Well, as I opened my remarks, I said that the best part of the 1619 project are its Ellisonian parts. There is an arresting sentence that she uses, and I'm wondering where she got it. She said that Black Americans have been the perfecters of our democracy. When I first read that, I said, I've seen that somewhere before, perfecters of democracy. And you know where I found it? It was in a 1970 Time magazine essay by Ralph Ellison called What America Would Be Like Without Black People, okay? And in that essay, Ellison makes a beautiful, eloquent argument with regards to how intrinsic, how so much a part of the warp and woof of the development of America, culturally, economically, politically, how much Black people are a part of this country, and that to try to extricate Blacks from our history is a fantasy. It's just ludicrous. And so he would agree with her intention. He would agree with her motives, but he wouldn't agree with the sloppy scholarship. And I don't think he would agree with the one-sided nature, what I call the zero-sum approach to history. In her history, she makes it seem like the only, that you could account for American history as a series of Black virtue triumphing over white vice. And Ellison saw American history way more complex than that. He would understand our history the way King understood it, the way Frederick Douglass understood it, two people that she studiously leaves out of her essay. And that is to say that this history of this country was built by Black and white together, that it has always been, even in the middle of slavery, in the midst of segregation, it has been a symbiotic relationship between whites and Blacks. Whites borrowing from what they see Black people doing, Blacks borrowing from what they see white people doing. And that's the development of American culture. And that's that symbiotic relationship that you see completely missing from the 1619 project's lead essay. And Ellison would disagree with that.
Can I add to that just very quickly? I know you're closing down, but That's great. I just add one little thing, because I often teach Invisible Man, and it goes the other way. That is that there is, Ellison is completely unapologetic about borrowing from, I mean, T.S. Eliot's Wasteland is a central element in the construction of, and the form of, and the thematic structure of Invisible Man. He's very much a part of the Western tradition and wants to be. He doesn't want to have to deny his blackness as part of that. That's a price he's not willing to pay, and he writes about this quite a bit. But he's also not willing to pay the price of cutting himself off from the broad Western tradition. And I think that there's a lot of currents that in these days in our intellectual life that would do that. And I think that the 1619 project dovetails with all of that, even if it isn't strictly an intention of it. Ellison absolutely was, I mean, the term integrationist has all kinds of implications, but he did not see, he saw a basis on which whites and blacks melded together, not a melting pot, but that their influences melded together to create a unique American culture that would not be what it was without the presence of Black people.
Well, I think, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there. Obviously, we could talk about Ellison for a couple more hours.
Indeed.
Before we sign off, I did want to point out that if you're eager for more on the 1619 project, Professor Morel is actually doing another webinar with Middlebury, which we're helping support. Later today, there's a link in the chat if you want to find it. So if your question, unfortunately, we weren't able to get to is all the questions, maybe you could throw it to him there and have better luck. I'm not sure. But I just want to thank you both so much for joining us. It was a really wonderful discussion to listen to.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Thanks
for the excuse to wear a tie. You know.
Well, you look lovely.
Yeah.
If you want to support the Jack Miller Center, you can find the link in the chat as well. We love supporting the study of America's founding principles and history, and we're glad Professors Morel and McClay could join us to do just that today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Goodbye to all.